There are people who move through digital dating platforms like shadows through walls. You sense it when you match with them, though you may not understand why. Their presence holds a hollowness that cannot be filled by more matches, better photos, or perfect bio-optimization. It rises from within, like a darkness that has been spreading since the first swipe, the first reduction of human connection to a binary choice made in 3 seconds. Something in their eyes, if you ever meet them in person, speaks of a fragmentation most people never consciously recognize. They are there, but not fully present, but partially engaged, but at a distance that has nothing to do with physical space. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, that rejected part of ourselves that grows stronger the more we deny its existence. But he also warned of something more insidious, the gradual dissolution of the embodied self when we begin living primarily through representations rather than authentic presence. What you are about to discover may disturb you deeply, for it reveals a process already underway in your own psyche. If you have spent significant time on these platforms, Jung documented the psychological effects of disembodied existence long before digital technology made such existence the norm. He understood that when we reduce ourselves to curated images and carefully worded descriptions, we don't simply present a limited version of ourselves. We begin the process of becoming that limited version, of shrinking our authentic presence to fit the constraints of the medium. These are not theories or technological critiques. They are recognizable patterns that emerge naturally in anyone who has spent months or years reducing potential partners to profiles, relationships to algorithms, and human connection to swipes. 7 distinct signs that reveal themselves without effort or intention. The person becoming a psychological ghost does not choose these transformations. They happen because the medium itself reshapes consciousness in ways Jung predicted would be catastrophic for human authenticity. But before we explore these 7 signs of digital ghosting, I need you to understand something crucial. This is not a judgment of people who use these platforms. This is a warning about what these platforms do to the human psyche when used as the primary means of connection. Drop a comment right now and tell me, have you noticed yourself changing since you started using these apps? Something subtle in how you view people, how you view yourself. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell because Jung's warnings about technological disembodiment are more urgent now than ever. Share this with anyone who's been dating online for more than 6 months. They need to understand what's happening beneath the surface of those endless swipes. The first sign appears when you realize you have started evaluating human beings like products on a digital shelf, not consciously, not with malicious intent, but automatically, reflexively, the way you might browse items you have no intention of purchasing. Jung warned about the dangers of what he called the persona, that social mask we present to the world. He understood that when we confuse the persona for authentic self, psychological fragmentation begins. But what happens when the entire architecture of connection forces both parties to interact exclusively through persona, through carefully curated representation with no embodied presence to ground it in human reality? You find yourself making snap judgments based on information that would be meaningless in authentic human encounter. A photo from a slightly unflattering angle becomes grounds for immediate rejection. A bio that doesn't spark instant intrigue gets swiped away before you've even consciously processed what you read. Height, occupation, education level, these data points become the primary basis for determining whether someone deserves the possibility of connection. You are not meeting humans. You are processing profiles. Jung observed that when we reduce complex human beings to simple categories, we commit violence against the soul, both theirs and ours. We lose the capacity to perceive the fullness of another person, the 1,000 subtle qualities that emerge only through embodied presence, through tone of voice and energy, and the inexplicable chemistry that cannot be photographed or described. You have become an evaluator, a sorter, a processor of human data, and with each swipe, you are training your consciousness to approach all human connection through this reductive lens. But here's what makes this first sign so insidious. You don't realize it's happening. The change is gradual, invisible, like a shadow growing longer as the sun sets. You think you're just being selective, just knowing what you want, just using the tools the platform provides. But Jung understood that the tools we use reshape our consciousness. When you spend hours each week reducing potential partners to swipeable data, you are rewiring your brain to perceive humans as objects to be evaluated, rather than mysteries to be encountered. Have you caught yourself doing this, making instant judgments about someone's worth, based on information that would be utterly irrelevant if you met them at a gathering of friends? Write in the comments. I evaluate if you recognize this pattern in yourself. Sometimes acknowledging what we've become is the first step toward reclaiming what we've lost. The second sign manifests as a visceral discomfort with real-world intimacy that has nothing to do with shyness or introversion. When you finally meet someone in person after weeks of messaging, something feels wrong. The ease of digital communication, the safety of the screen, the ability to craft and edit your responses, all of this disappears. You are suddenly confronted with the raw reality of embodied presence, and it feels invasive in a way it never did before you started living primarily through digital mediation. Jung wrote extensively about the importance of embodied experience for psychological health. He understood that when we lose connection to our physical, sensory, immediate experience of reality, we become unmoored from the grounding that keeps us psychologically integrated. The body knows truths the mind can deny. The body responds to presence in ways that cannot be faked or curated. When you meet someone face to face, you cannot control the angle of your appearance. You cannot edit your words before speaking them. You cannot disappear if the conversation becomes uncomfortable. This is terrifying for someone who has become accustomed to the mediated safety of digital interaction. Real eye contact feels too intense, too revealing. Physical proximity creates anxiety that has nothing to do with attraction or its absence. You find yourself longing to retreat back to the safety of the screen, where you can control your presentation and protect yourself from the vulnerability of being fully seen. The person sitting across from you is not the fantasy you constructed from their curated profile. They are a complex, messy, unpredictable human being, and you have lost the capacity to be comfortable with that level of reality. But here's where Jung's insight becomes crucial. This discomfort is not a personal failing or a sign that you haven't met the right person. It is a symptom of psychological fragmentation, the splitting of consciousness that occurs when we begin living primarily through representation rather than authentic presence. Your digital self, the carefully constructed persona you present through profiles and messages, has become more real to you than your embodied self. And now that embodied self feels foreign, uncomfortable, like clothes that no longer fit, you might rationalize this discomfort. Tell yourself you're just anxious, just need more time, just haven't found someone you truly connect with. But Jung would recognize this as a more fundamental problem. You are losing your capacity for embodied connection altogether. Each time you retreat from the discomfort of real-world intimacy back to the safety of the screen, you are training yourself to prefer the ghost to the human, the representation to the reality. The third sign reveals itself when you realize you can describe yourself better in text than in person. Your bio is polished, clever, engaging. Your messages flow with personality and charm. But when someone asks you to tell them about yourself in person, you stumble. The words that came so easily through the screen now feel awkward, inadequate, somehow false, even though they describe the same person. Jung understood that authentic self-expression emerges from a deep place within, from what he called the self with a capital S. that core of being that transcends ego and persona. When we speak from this place, our words carry a certain resonance, a truthfulness that others can feel even if they cannot articulate why. But when we live primarily through curated digital presentation, we begin to lose touch with this deeper self. We become skilled at presenting a persona, at saying what we think will be well received, at performing an identity rather than inhabiting one. Your digital self is not you. It is a construction, a carefully edited highlight reel, a persona designed to attract and impress. And the more time you spend inhabiting this digital self, the more distant you become from your authentic self. Jung called this process shadow absorption, the gradual disappearance of rejected or ignored aspects of self until only the persona remains. But what he observed in his patients is now occurring on a mass scale through these platforms. Millions of people are losing touch with their authentic selves, becoming increasingly proficient at performance while increasingly alienated from genuine self-expression. Here's what makes this particularly dangerous. You start to prefer your digital self to your real self. The digital version is more attractive, more interesting, more successful at generating attention and validation. Your real self, with all its awkwardness and vulnerability and complexity, begins to feel like a disappointment in comparison. You find yourself wishing you could live entirely through the screen, where you can maintain control over how you are perceived. The ghost you created is more appealing than the human you are, and you are slowly starving the human to feed the ghost. But Jung warned that this path leads only to psychological disintegration. The more we abandon our authentic self in favor of a constructed persona, the more we experience what he called neurotic suffering, a deep sense of meaninglessness and disconnection that no amount of external validation can resolve. You are becoming less real, less present, less human. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the carefully maintained digital persona, you know it. Subscribe. If you are starting to recognize yourself in these patterns, hit that bell icon, because Jung's insights into psychological fragmentation are more relevant now than they have ever been. And keep watching, because the next 4 signs reveal how deep this ghosting process goes, how far you may have already drifted from your authentic human presence without even realizing it. The 4th sign emerges when rejection stops feeling human and starts feeling algorithmic. Someone doesn't respond to your message, and instead of experiencing it as a personal interaction, you feel it as a systemic failure. The algorithm didn't match you properly, your photos aren't optimized, your bio needs tweaking. You have stopped experiencing rejection as one human being declining connection with another human being, and started experiencing it as a technical problem to be solved through better optimization. Jung observed that when we deny the emotional reality of our experiences, when we rationalize away feelings that make us uncomfortable, we create what he called complexes, split-off portions of psyche that continue to influence us unconsciously, even though we refuse to acknowledge them consciously. Every rejection you experience on these platforms creates emotional impact, whether you allow yourself to feel it or not. But the architecture of these apps encourages you to process rejection as data rather than experience it as human interaction. This creates a profound numbness, a protective dissociation from the emotional reality of repeated rejection. You are being rejected dozens, hundreds, perhaps thousands of times. Each person who swipes past your profile without pausing, each match who never messages, each conversation that dies mid-exchange, each date that doesn't lead to another. In embodied human interaction, experiencing this volume of rejection would be devastating. It would force you to confront uncomfortable truths, to process grief and disappointment, to develop genuine resilience through feeling and integrating difficult emotions. But the digital format allows you to bypass this emotional processing. You don't see the people who reject you. You don't experience their rejection as a conscious choice one human makes about another. It happens invisibly, algorithmically, systemically, and so you learn to rationalize it away, to attribute it to technical factors rather than human factors, to protect yourself from the emotional impact through dissociation rather than genuine emotional processing. Jung would recognize this as a dangerous form of splitting, the division of consciousness into parts that no longer communicate with each other. Your conscious mind tells you that rejection doesn't matter, that it's just part of the process, that you simply need to optimize your approach, but your unconscious mind is absorbing every rejection, storing every disappointment, accumulating emotional wounds that you refuse to acknowledge or process. This split cannot be maintained indefinitely. Eventually, the shadow material you have been repressing will erupt in ways you cannot control: depression, rage, cynicism, or a complete inability to trust or connect with others. Here's what Jung understood: that the designers of these platforms either don't know or don't care about emotional numbing is not resilience. Dissociation is not strength. When you train yourself not to feel the emotional reality of repeated rejection, you are not protecting yourself. You are fragmenting yourself, cutting off access to vital emotional intelligence that you need for authentic human connection. The fifth sign appears as a disturbing realization. You remember profile details but forget faces. Someone you matched with weeks ago sends you a message, and you have to scroll back through your conversation to remember who they are. You can recall what their bio said, maybe even specific jokes from your message exchange, but you cannot picture their face. They have become words and information rather than a human being you encountered, even digitally. Jung wrote about the difference between thinking and feeling as two of four fundamental functions of consciousness. Thinking processes information logically and analytically. Feeling evaluates based on personal values and emotional resonance. In healthy psychological functioning, these work together to create integrated understanding of reality. But these platforms systematically privilege thinking over feeling, information processing over embodied recognition, data analysis over human intuition. You are training your consciousness to approach potential partners through thinking rather than feeling, through analytical valuation rather than embodied recognition. And this has profound consequences for your capacity to form genuine connection. When you meet someone in person, the most important information comes not from what they tell you about themselves, but from how you feel in their presence, the energy between you, the subtle chemistry that cannot be quantified, the inexplicable sense of recognition or repulsion that arises before either of you speaks a word. But you have been training yourself to override this embodied knowing, to privilege information over intuition, to evaluate potential partners based on data points rather than felt sense. You can remember that someone went to a particular university, works in a particular field, enjoys particular hobbies, but you cannot remember how their presence made you feel, because you never truly experienced their presence. You only processed their data. Jung believed that genuine connection, what he called participation mystique, requires a breaking down of ego boundaries, a willingness to be affected by another person's energy and presence in ways that transcend rational understanding. But when you approach potential partners as profiles to be evaluated rather than humans to be encountered, you maintain rigid ego boundaries that prevent this kind of genuine meeting. You are gathering information about them, but you are never truly meeting them, never allowing yourself to be touched by their humanity in ways that might change you. The result is a strange kind of amnesia. You have hundreds of matches, dozens of conversations, perhaps several dates, but when you try to remember these people, you draw a blank. They did not make a lasting impression because you never genuinely encountered them. You were too busy evaluating, optimizing, protecting yourself behind your carefully maintained persona to allow real contact. They remain ghosts, as do you. Comment: I forget faces. If this pattern feels familiar, sometimes naming what we have lost is necessary before we can begin to reclaim it, and we are only beginning to understand how deep this ghosting process goes. The sixth sign manifests as relationships that never leave the platform. You have been messaging someone for weeks, maybe months. The conversation flows easily. You feel connected, understood, seen. But when the possibility of meeting in person arises, one or both of you finds reasons to delay. Not ready yet, too busy this week, maybe next month. The connection feels real and meaningful in its digital form, but the prospect of embodied encounter creates anxiety that neither of you fully acknowledges. Jung observed that when people remain in fantasy, rather than risk the disappointment of reality, they are protecting themselves from genuine intimacy. He called this the Puritanis complex. When it appeared in men, the eternal youth, who refuses to fully commit to adult reality. But what these platforms create is a collective version of this complex. Millions of people maintaining fantasy connections that never mature into embodied relationship, because embodied relationship requires vulnerability that fantasy does not. In the digital space, you can maintain perfect control. You can edit your words, present your best self, disappear when things get uncomfortable. You never have to confront the awkwardness of silence, the vulnerability of being seen at unflattering angles, the risk of discovering that the chemistry you felt through the screen doesn't translate to physical presence. The fantasy is safer, cleaner, more manageable than the messy reality of embodied connection. But Jung understood that growth requires confronting reality, not retreating into fantasy. When you avoid embodied encounter in favor of prolonged digital connection, you are not building toward relationship. You are avoiding relationship while maintaining the comforting illusion that you are pursuing it. You are addicted to the possibility of connection while terrified of the reality of it. You have become a ghost who courts other ghosts, both of you preferring the fantasy to the risk of discovering what might be real. Here's the truly disturbing part. You might not even realize you are doing this. You genuinely believe you want to meet in person. You tell yourself you are just being careful, just taking your time, just waiting for the right moment. But Jung would recognize this as resistance, the unconscious sabotaging of conscious intentions. When those intentions threaten to confront you with uncomfortable truths, you are afraid. Afraid of disappointment, afraid of rejection, afraid of discovering that you have lost the capacity for embodied intimacy altogether. The seventh and final sign is the most disturbing. You no longer fully recognize yourself without digital mediation. You take photos for your profile and spend 20 minutes adjusting filters, angles, lighting, until the image looks right. Not accurate, but right. An idealized version that others respond to positively. You craft messages with the same care, editing and revising, until they sound clever, interesting, authentic, in a way that requires extensive artifice to achieve. Then you catch sight of yourself in a mirror, unexpectedly, or someone takes a candid photo of you, and something feels wrong. That person doesn't look like you, or rather, they look like you used to look before you started curating your image so carefully. The gap between your authentic self and your digital persona has grown so wide that you can no longer comfortably inhabit your authentic self. You have become the ghost you created, and the real human underneath has started to feel like the imposter. Jung called this phenomenon identification with the persona, and he considered it one of the most dangerous psychological conditions a person could develop. When we confuse our social mask with our authentic self, we lose touch with the deeper sources of meaning and vitality that can only be accessed through genuine self-knowledge. We become hollow, performing an identity rather than living one, maintaining an image rather than developing substance. But what Jung observed in individual patients is now occurring on a civilizational scale through these platforms. Millions of people are losing touch with their authentic selves, becoming increasingly skilled at digital self-presentation, while increasingly alienated from the embodied human underneath the performance. You look at your profile and see yourself. You look in the mirror and see a stranger. The ghost has become more real than the person, and you can no longer distinguish between them. Here's what Jung understood about this condition. It cannot be resolved through better performance or more effective self-presentation. The solution is not to improve your profile, to take better photos, to craft cleverer messages. The solution is to step away from the digital mediation altogether, to reclaim embodied presence as the primary mode of connection, to rediscover who you are when you are not performing for an algorithm. But this is terrifying for someone who has spent years becoming a digital ghost. Returning to full embodied presence means confronting all the vulnerability and uncertainty and lack of control that you have been avoiding through digital mediation. It means allowing yourself to be seen completely, without filters or carefully worded bios or the safety of the screen. It means risking genuine rejection, real disappointment, the possibility that you will be found wanting when you cannot control every aspect of how you are perceived. Yet Jung would tell you that this risk is necessary, that psychological health requires authentic self-knowledge and genuine connection, neither of which can be achieved through curated digital performance, that the temporary safety of the screen is not worth the long-term cost of becoming a ghost in your own life, present but not fully present, engaged but not fully engaged, alive but not fully alive. If these 7 signs have resonated with something deep inside you, perhaps you are already beginning to sense how far you have drifted from your authentic human presence. Jung wrote that the first step towards psychological integration is always recognition, the honest acknowledgement of what we have become, rather than what we wish we were. This recognition is painful but necessary. You cannot reclaim what you do not acknowledge you have lost. Jung also understood that awareness alone is not sufficient. Recognition must be followed by action, by deliberate choices to move differently through the world, to prioritize embodied presence over digital performance, to risk the vulnerability of authentic connection over the safety of curated presentation. This is difficult work, perhaps some of the most difficult psychological work a person can undertake in our current cultural moment. These platforms are designed to be addictive, to exploit our psychological needs and weaknesses in ways that keep us engaged, despite the harm they cause. But you are not powerless. Jung believed deeply in the human capacity for consciousness and choice, in our ability to recognize destructive patterns and deliberately choose different ways of being. Every time you close the app and engage with the physical world around you, you are choosing embodied presence over digital dissociation. Every time you have a face-to-face conversation without checking your phone, you are reclaiming your capacity for genuine attention. Every time you allow yourself to be seen without filters or careful curation, you are practicing the vulnerability that authentic connection requires. The women with old souls that we explored in another video had learned to trust embodied knowing, to value authentic presence over social performance. They had done the difficult work of integrating shadow material rather than repressing it. They had developed what Jung called psychological discrimination, the ability to distinguish between genuine intuition and ego-driven fantasy. These same capacities are what you need now to reclaim your human presence from the digital ghost you have been becoming. Jung observed that certain souls carry within them a remembering, an embodied knowledge of what human connection felt like before it was mediated through screens and algorithms. If you have felt increasing unease with these platforms, increasing awareness that something essential is being lost, that remembering is stirring within you, it is calling you back to embodied presence, to the risk and messiness and unpredictability of genuine human encounter. There are others who feel this same calling, who recognize these signs in themselves and are ready to reclaim their authentic human presence. You are not alone in experiencing this digital ghosting. and you are not alone in wanting to become fully human again. Subscribe to continue exploring Jung's insights into psychological integration in the digital age. Hit that notification bell, because these conversations about consciousness and technology are more urgent with each passing day. Comment which of these 7 signs hit you hardest. Which one made you realize how far you have drifted from embodied authenticity? Do you remember what it felt like to form connections without digital mediation? Have you noticed yourself changing in ways you cannot fully articulate? Your story matters, your awareness matters, and there are others here who need to know they are not the only ones trying to find their way back to genuine human presence. Share this video with anyone you know who has been using these platforms as their primary means of connection. They need to understand what Jung warned about decades before this technology existed, that when we lose embodied presence, we lose access to the deepest sources of meaning and vitality available to human consciousness. We become ghosts haunting our own lives, present but not fully present, alive but not fully alive, connected but not genuinely connected. The path back to embodied authenticity is not easy, but it is possible. It requires consciousness, courage, and commitment to something these platforms cannot provide: the vulnerability of being fully seen, fully present, fully human, in all your imperfect and unpredictable reality. Jung believed that this kind of authenticity was not only possible, but necessary for psychological health and genuine fulfillment. The question is whether you are ready to step away from the ghost and reclaim the human, whether you are willing to risk the discomfort of embodied vulnerability for the possibility of authentic connection, whether you remember enough of what it felt like to be fully present, to recognize what you have lost, and to fight to get it back. Your authentic self is still there beneath the carefully curated digital persona, quieter now perhaps, harder to hear through the noise of notifications and matches and endless swiping, but still there, still waiting, still hoping you will remember what it means to be embodied, present, and fully human in a world that is rapidly forgetting. Jung taught that the work of individuation, of becoming fully yourself, is the central task of human psychological development. But how can you become yourself when you have lost touch with who you are beneath the performance? How can you individuate when you are living primarily through a digital ghost that represents only the aspects of yourself you have decided are marketable? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the essential questions of our moment, the psychological crisis that defines an entire generation's relationship to connection and authenticity. And Jung's work offers us a framework for understanding what we have lost and how we might begin to reclaim it. But understanding is not enough. Recognition must lead to action. Awareness must lead to different choices. Knowledge must lead to transformation. The work begins now, with the simple but profound choice to close the app, to look up from the screen, to engage with the embodied world around you with full presence and attention. The work continues with each subsequent choice to prioritize authentic connection over digital performance, embodied presence over algorithmic optimization, human messiness over curated perfection. This is the path back to your authentic self. Not through better profiles or more strategic swiping, but through the deliberate reclaiming of embodied presence as the primary mode of being, through the courageous vulnerability of allowing yourself to be fully seen without the protection of the screen, through the patient work of rebuilding capacity for genuine connection that these platforms have systematically eroded. Jung believed in the human capacity for psychological integration and authentic development. He believed that consciousness and choice could overcome even the most entrenched patterns and destructive habits. He believed that we are not powerless before the forces that fragment us, but that we must develop awareness and will to resist those forces and choose differently. You have the power to step back from the digital ghosting and reclaim your embodied human presence. The question is whether you will use it, Whether you recognize these patterns clearly enough to choose differently. Whether you remember what authentic connection feels like well enough to fight for it against the powerful forces that profit from your continued dissociation. The ghosts you have been swiping through are real people who have lost touch with their authentic selves, just as you may have lost touch with yours. The tragedy is not that the platforms exist, but that we have allowed them to become the primary means of connection, the default mode of seeking intimacy, the replacement for embodied human encounter, rather than a supplement to it. Jung's warning echoes across the decades when we live primarily through representation rather than presence, through persona rather than authentic self, through digital mediation rather than embodied reality. We lose access to the sources of meaning and vitality that make human life worth living. We become ghosts, and the world becomes ghostly, and genuine connection becomes impossible because there is no longer anyone genuinely present to connect with. But it does not have to be this way. You can choose presence over performance. You can choose embodiment over digital dissociation. You can choose the vulnerability of being fully seen over the safety of careful curation. You can choose to become human again, to reclaim the authentic self you have been slowly abandoning in favor of the more manageable digital ghost. This is Jung's invitation and his warning, the work of becoming fully yourself, of psychological integration and authentic development, is the most important work you will ever do. And it cannot be done through a screen. It requires embodied presence, courageous vulnerability, and the willingness to be imperfect and unpredictable and fully human in a world that increasingly values none of those things. The choice is yours, the ghost or the human, the performance or the presence, the algorithm or the embodied encounter. Choose wisely, for what you choose now shapes not only who you become, but what human connection itself becomes in the strange and increasingly disembodied world we are creating together. Let us walk this path back to embodied authenticity together, supporting each other as we do the difficult work of reclaiming presence in an age of digital dissociation. Subscribe, comment, share, and most importantly, close the app, look up, be present, be vulnerable, be human. Jung would tell you that this simple choice is the beginning of everything.